So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also interview special guests involved in writing and publishing. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters who make this show possible. Patrons get to listen to episodes of the show early and gain access to a treasure trove of bonus content that I'm regularly adding to, including over 70 bonus episodes, the TV pilot screenplay I wrote with the novel's character, and more. Please check it out at patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. I'm going to say, as best as I have been able to, I have made every episode in this series something where it could be your first. You could just be airdropped right into it and know enough to get the meat and potatoes of what I'm laying down. This is the final story outline episode, or at least for a very long time it will be. I'll explain that later. So it does engage in a little more continuity as a result. But, I'm going to do my best. Hang in there. And if you're thinking, geez, I don't know, this is maybe not the best first episode, that's cool. The archives are all there. Go back to number 1 or any other one that appeals to you. You wonderful, wonderful person. Last episode, we talked about my Sword and Planet adventure for Voe, an imported god. And that was quite the journey, both in the podcast itself being about an hour and a half, and in the outlining taking me about 6 months around, everything else I had going on in my life. For this penultimate story outline, I knew I didn't want it to take 6 friggin' months. In fact, before I started working on it in earnest, as with all of these, I'd made the odd note when I thought of it along the way, working on other stories, I sat down and I wrote a simple project outline diary entry. In it, I wrote, on June 2nd, 2024, I've decided to outline zone story and then leave stairs for later, after I see what I discover in drafting all these stories. I think it will make stairs better, and I think I need to switch to drafting soon, or I'll lose my damn mind. Then I wrote a bunch of other stuff, and it culminates in the main thing to share with you here, which is me finishing the entry by writing again. Meanwhile, how do I avoid outlining the zone story taking 6 months? Now, before I tackle that, I feel like I should get into what exactly I mean by a zone story. You've already seen the name of this episode, and that'll be explained later, but it's a kind of story. It's a zone story. What's that? Well, it's actually the story following up the original Voe story, which I had on my mind for the absolute longest. My first notes for that are predating the denim notebook in a little slim fella, I don't know how else to describe it, a little slim fella where I outlined the original Voe story, and the date here for this note is December 1st, 2019, holy crap, a little over 5 years ago. In a nutshell, I was thinking of 2 major texts and a few other ones. The 2 major texts on my mind were the film Stalker and its inspiration, Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers, a couple of Russian fellows who wrote some damn good sci-fi, and the original Area X novel by Jeff Vandermeer, Annihilation. Both stories involve sites on Earth with loosely defined borders, but borders nonetheless, within which the general laws of physics and how things are supposed to function in reality are sort of not right and changing constantly in little ways that make it very hard to nail them down as part of like a new science. People do their best, they have theories, some things are more consistent than others, but fundamentally these zones defy easy categorization and absorption into our scientific canon. If you're not familiar with either of those texts I've cited, don't worry about it. I've just told you everything you need to know for the purposes of this episode. And so, coming back to my slim notebook here, predating this whole big project, back when I was first thinking, what if I did more Voe stories? What if it grew into a whole book? I wrote the following. Medieval zone fiction. Stalkers with short swords pillaging an area birthed when a wizard, quote, just burst open. Voe must travel through it to get where she's going, but also to figure out if the wizard who birthed the thing was her wizard, the one who trapped her and her people on that island with their mortal enemies. I then made a bunch of other notes, which kind of come up later, so I'm not going to get into them now, about a page worth, and restudied Annihilation, to get some ideas from that, as you can imagine, to better understand where I was walking into. I would do Stalker/Roadside Picnic later. And credit where credit is due, there was a specific article that inspired me, which I hope still exists. If it does, I'll link to it in the show notes. That article was called A Brief History of the Zone, the Sci-Fi Idea That Swallows Everything, written by Clayton Purdom, published October 17th, 2019. How can I tell you all that without having gone to check if it's still online? Because I'm a maniac who printed it out and put it in a binder with a whole bunch of other things. It keeps these things from being forgotten by me. To be honest, I've experimented a lot with things like Evernote, and they're just way too out of sight, out of mind to work for me. So I have to pretend I'm a 9,000-year-old man and print out articles that really mean a lot to me. So okay, leap ahead a little bit to January 31st, 2020, when I am first brainstorming what stories I want to have in the untitled Sword and Sorcery novel with Voe, and the very first one was Fantasy Zone story. Now, as I do, I made the odd note along the way in my Stray Thoughts pages, but I didn't really do anything with this in detail until mid-year 2024. At that point, I was getting near the end of outlining Imported God, the Sword and Planet story. I could feel like the desire to move on getting strong, and so I did write 1 or 2 pages of notes, but it wasn't even then until I finished outlining the Sword and Planet story that I got tucked in earnest. I tried to be disciplined because the story I was working on, An Imported God, had a lot of big ideas, as you'll hear if you listen to that episode. And I knew this thing was going to be very abstract and strange, as basically every story in this final quarter of the novel had been, so it would require some heavy thinking to get my noggin around it, and I didn't want to be diffused while I did that. Most any stray thought I had between early 2020 and mid-2024 about this story will come up later, but there is one thing I'd like to mention from August 24th, 2023. You see, at this point, I was still considering having the second last story in the novel be something I was referring to just as Little Voe. The idea being I would either tell a story of Voe's childhood that would provide interesting context for the final story, or Voe and her cosmic travels would be sent back through time to her home island to do something there without messing up the timeline, that being the fun challenge. But ultimately, I abandoned that idea because it felt too much like something I did in one form or another in each of my first 2 novels, where near the finale I felt compelled to visit the much earlier childhood of the main character. In both Junkyard Leopard and Of Dice and Men, those novels, while they weren't genre the way this thing is, there were no fantastic elements, so those were kind of flashbacks. Here it's time travel. I guess that's different, but Still, I just thought, I'm only going to get to write so many novels in my life. Do I want to keep repeating certain things within them? And the answer is no. At this stage, having just reread Annihilation and Roadside Picnic and made a bunch of notes here, I was like, maybe this story could be like a hybrid of a Zone story and Little Voe. In the Voe's life before leaving the island, when she yearned for adventure, could be contrasted with and used to inform her Zone adventure. Now she's had many travels and seen all kinds of things as the patron's servant. And ultimately, I went another route, but childhood still ended up informing the story in a major way, just not Voe's, not exactly. Also, the concept of Voe being very, very jaded, very I have seen everything, man, played a major role as well. I mean, she was kind of getting there in the last story, but here, ho mama, she has chewed all the flavor out of the gum that is, quote-unquote, adventuring. So, in a zone, well, it's a place that things are weird. I've talked before about weird with a capital W on my own, and in I Love the Interview with Scott Dorward, which you can check out in the archives if you so desire. But in a nutshell, the weird with a capital W, well, that's got to be stuff that is weird as in unfamiliar, weird as in pulp fiction weird, which tends to be a blend of horror, sci-fi, and occasionally fantasy. You want, when writing weird with a capital W, to try and take people to a place that is thrilling for how it is shocking, for how it is different, for how it is familiar, for how it is uncanny, for how it is hard to define, all of which makes writing it a challenge, all of which fed into my early decision to allow myself some absolute late end of the book continuity, which I had resisted in previous stories, by not sending Voe to somewhere so friggin' weird, man, by instead sending her to somewhere familiar. the sort of not Northwest France of the second story in the whole dang book, The Woman Who Floated Out of Time. I felt like this would be fun because if you've been reading the book from start to finish, of course, you're like, oh wow, we're going back to that place. For the first time ever, we're going back to the setting of a story. I thought it would be useful for the weird by having the reader be bathed in something familiar before exposing them to the unfamiliar. And I thought it would be kind of neat for Voe from a character perspective because she has been feeling particularly lost and away from home below these many years. And really, I would think she would want to return to the first place she came to find a friend and, a new home, essentially, for a little while after having escaped the island her and her people and their enemies have been trapped on. If I returned her to the island, I mean, that'd be kind of like going back to prison, right? Not so charming and warm and fuzzy. Meanwhile, it's been many, many years, more than Voe's physical age suggests it has been, since she was in this setting. So bringing back her, man-at-arms buddy, Towan, from that story, but having Towan be quite a few years older, be like a senior citizen almost, and be kind of looking at Voe like, why are you only 35? You should be like my age. Gets us that frisson of the unfamiliar and the familiar and the familiar and the unfamiliar all rubbing around against each other, creating some intriguing sparks of character, setting, story, etc. And so the brainstorming continued. Brainstorming and retreading my old notes. For example, I loved an idea I had early on where the old myths that people told each other so they know the rules of what they assume are, let's say, fairies in the woods causing problems, are made out of date by this zone in our fantasy, not Northwest France, because it keeps changing so fast that someone might say, our stories can't keep up, right? Because what are the stories if not just, warnings, essentially, about like, don't go here, don't do that, etc. This ended up dovetailing with something else that came to mind on the same day. What if the zone messes with Voe's connection to the supernatural patron that's kept her in cosmic debt slavery, essentially, all this time? What if it either sets her free or seems like it could? And then I'm thinking, here's the dovetail. What if by pushing the boundaries of narrative, Voe earns her freedom, rather than what was my current idea of simply having her captor just up and decide to free her at the beginning of the final story, the one after this? Not too captivating. Then I briefly considered what if this story has a different point of view situation than anything which came before it in the whole book. What if instead of what I'd been doing in this particular quarter, which is having Voe do a first-person past tense report to her patron of what happened in her adventure, what if multiple other people gave different conflicting points of view? Could be interesting, made me very much think of the Area X books, which tend to have multiple points of view. But nah, at the end of the day, that's where I stop making a decision because it's the right decision from the story. And instead of just like, well, I'm, inspired by these things, I guess I should just directly imitate them, which in my opinion is not a good way to go. So I put that back down again and decided to just go, yeah, no, we'll do this one like the others. We'll do Voe, past tense first person POV telling us what happened. But I mentioned this because it kind of crept back in on the back end. And then I got to something really key. I got back to kind of thinking about how, okay, if Voe frees herself from bondage, from the patron, how could maybe harnessing the capital W weird, this concept at the heart of the story, the weird, and this thing that keeps floating around it, storytelling, how could Voe harness the weird and storytelling to set herself free? The weird is, so to speak, is what she's been swimming in, really her whole adventuring life, but particularly this last corner. And storytelling is not just what I'm doing with the book. I'm not just doing the writer thing of, patting myself on the back for how clever I am and how important storytelling is to everything in the known universe. I'm also thinking about how Voe was raised on stories by her mom of heroics that ultimately inspired her to get off the island in the very first story. So if it could be like a key element in this story where she once again finds freedom from magical bondage, that could be kind of cool. Because I do feel that escaping her debt, peonage, slavery, whatever, with violence, magic, or both, well, it feels like an easy out that we all often fantasize about in our day-to-day, whether we're thinking about credit card debt, a job we hate, or other things that bind us. But is doing that here in the story a cop-out? How could it not be a cop-out, I start thinking. And also how might it connect to another idea that I really like that's growing out of my earlier notions about Little Voe, etc. How might this connect to an idea that at the heart of the thing, the zone, there could be perhaps some kind of vortex of primordial first memories of reading or imagination really catching fire, memories of that kind of thing. Because that's, something I found myself wondering to when I was thinking, like, what's really at the heart of all this stuff, Weird is the core concept of the story that I want to explore and dance around and play in. But what's beneath weird is imagination, which I know, corny, right? The power of imagination, the power of reading. But I'm just thinking about the reader sitting in front of this book. I'm thinking about the guy writing it. And one of the most primordial memories for me, one of the memories that really makes me still feel something, is thinking back to my first memory of reading when I was, I think, 4 years old, maybe 3 and change. I don't know exactly what time of year it was. I was in my parents' living room, or we had this old purple sort of shag carpet, whatever, it was the 80s. And I was lying on my stomach while my parents watched TV. I don't know what they were watching, though, because my face was buried in a Batman comic. And this comic was really grabbing me because it used a mixture of Batman and other like people in the foreground and stuff being drawn, but then had like, I don't know what technique they used exactly back then, but now we would call it kind of a Photoshop of a photo, pictures of what were probably New York skylines with major, things like the Empire State Building removed, and then kind of like outlined and drawn around and so on. Yeah, I'm not describing it very well. I'll have to grab the issue, which I still have. Actually, I found a copy years later. And maybe I'll put a photo of that in the show notes or something. But yeah, anyway, it just had this mix of Batman sort of, with his line going across the city, and the city being given this incredible sense of depth and sort of uncanny reality because of how it was sort of rendered from different raw material than the man himself. Anyway, when I think back to that and a few other moments like it, that just has incredible power. And here we are reading this book with this character for whom storytelling was such a motivating thing. And this particular story, the weird, this kind of imagination, essentially, that we really want to touch upon. And it just all feels adjacent. It feels that feeling you get when you're writing sometimes, and you just go, God, I'm fumbling kind of half in the dark here, but I'm fumbling towards something good. Gotta keep going. So what if somehow the first memory of reading, or a vortex of people's first memories of reading or first memories of imagination really catching fire, right? Because what's sorcery? Making things come about because you will it. What's imagination? That, but it's only coming about in your head or on the page. What if that could play a role in Voe's escape from servitude? This very important question persisted until pretty much the point where I realized I had to stop outlining this thing and move on. So yeah, we'll circle back to it for sure. After this point, I experimented with, what would I do with this element or that element that I saw as a common thing between the Stalker and Annihilation tales I was kind of riffing off of, but very quickly realized like none of these other ideas I was grabbing at were right for this one. Voe doesn't have a spouse, for example, something that's key to those other two books. And at the end, I found myself saying once again, we don't want this to take 6 months to outline. So I had to stop and say, what do we absolutely need for this thing? And well, you can't have a story without some kind of structure. So that's where I went next. Which in a way brings us back to weird, right? I'm thinking, is this going to be structured as normality followed by escalating weirdness until, pow, the biggest weirdness of all? No, I'm thinking then it's just seeking shock value, and the reader will be braced for it. Then I think about creating kind of a rhythm. I wrote down here, we have like an intro and something weird. And then we have like something normal and kind of, a process of getting us forward. Then something weirder than the first weirdness. Then more normal and proceeding through the storyline, Then something weirder than the preceding two weird things. and then normality and proceeding through the plot line, and then the weirdest thing of all, followed by a wee epilogue to let us come down from all that. Okay, sure. Why did that come to me so easily? Because, well, I've seen that a lot too, but it felt better than just a steady ramping up. And even in the sort of normal story proceeding whatever segments, you could still have like intergroup tension, and other things. It's not that they would be calm per se, just that they would be lacking capital W weird. So, okay, that felt good enough for the moment. Come on, let's keep moving, Oliver. Let's keep moving. What's something else we want to have in every single one of our stories? A thematic statement or conflict. Now, I'd already had some like fumbling towards thematic statement in my earlier notes. And so here I started asking myself, well, do I still like a concept that I had, which was maybe the statement is, the world is always more complicated than we can dream of, which I didn't like it then, and I certainly don't like saying it out loud now. I'm sure you can hear how that's kind of weak. It's not really saying anything of any great value. It's not saying anything terribly definitive, just like, hey, isn't everything kind of wild and there's things that we don't know? Like, all right, cool, fine. It felt wishy-washy, a less interesting version of our thematic conflict from Love Letter to a Sailor. Then I thought to myself, well, what if I pinch a thematic statement I had set aside for the final story, Stairs? That statement being, control is antithetical to love. I don't want to steal that. Okay, so in exploring what is truly capital W weird, what conflict could we be examining from several angles? What statement could we be making? Weird will set you free would line up with Voe's arc in the story, but I still thought I could do better. Make that one angle on a thematic conflict rather than a singular statement. But plainly, I needed to cook a little longer before I could get that thematic statement that I needed. And so, once more, I returned to the Merrill Collection in Toronto, the Western Hemisphere's largest archive of science fiction and fantasy, founded by Judith Merrill and the Toronto Public Library System in 1970. Yes, I knew they had a fantastic collection of pulps, and so I asked, do you have Weird Tales #1? They had many, many, many original Weird Tales copies, including some very early ones, but if I remember correctly, as it has been almost half a year now, they only had a reprint, but it was a good quality reprint, so hey, whatever, right? Weird Tales #1 I thought might have maybe like a manifesto or something in it where they themselves were trying to find like, what is weird? What is a weird tale? The way that many other magazines, including my own, New Age Sword and Sorcery, like to do in their very first issue, is a kind of saying, here's why we stand out. Here's what we do. Here's why you want to keep coming back to us. Weird Tales #1 promise stories that will startle and amaze you. All right. And every story is an odd and remarkable flight of man's imagination. Okay. Some are creepy, some deal in masterly fashion with forbidden subjects like insanity. Some are concerned with the supernatural, and others with material things of horror. All are out of the ordinary, surprisingly new and unusual. A sensational departure from the beaten track. That is the reason for Weird Tales. So, okay, I've got to work some of this vocabulary into the story. Startle and amaze, at least. And then I looked at the editorial, right? I want to see what the editor had to say in this very first issue. The editorial in Weird Tales was called The Eyrie, Eyrie. Oh ho, the name of my story for now. And a few sentences leapt out to me from that editorial. I'm not going to read the whole thing, that'd be wild. Sentences like, such stories are tabooed elsewhere, and nor does the moral question of good taste present an obstacle. Okay? And we do believe, however, that these stories can cause you to forget your surroundings. Nothing is forbidden, we can go anywhere, and you may find it really disorienting. That's a compelling promise. From Weird Tales, I leapt to The Weird Tale by S.T. Joshi, which I made some interesting statements, one of which I liked. Weird Tales are the consequence of a world view, right? You have to have a point of view, otherwise nothing's weird because nothing's outside of that point of view. Or there's no point of view for the weird things to be outside of. You get what I'm saying. In this essay by S.T. Joshi, 4 elements were identified of a weird tale. 1. Supernatural horror. 2. Fantasy. 3. Quasi-science fiction. 4. Non-supernatural horror. Quasi-sci-fi is attention-grabbing out of those 4, I feel. So to elaborate, the quasi-sci-fi thing is basically when there's an implication in the story that we may one day be able to account for the, quote, supranormal phenomena, but cannot do so now. And these tales are not actual science fiction because of their manifest intent to incite horror. If anything is intended to inspire horror, then it is to be classed as a subject of the weird tale. This is some classic genre nerd nitpickery, which I find kind of amusing. The idea that science fiction is not science fiction if it's something we could conceivably figure out one day as opposed to total science fantasy, right? Like Doctor Who's TARDIS or whatever. Stuff that's basically magic but has sci-fi trappings. And if we're trying to incite horror, then it definitely can't be science fiction because S.T. Joshi says so. So I find myself asking, am I writing a story with intent to inspire horror? And I wrote yes in all caps. Now, horror really needs natural law to be violated, while fantasy is home to the unnatural. So how do we square that circle? I suppose by establishing the normality outside the zone with things like Toan and this landscape that Voe is somewhat familiar with from when she was much younger, and so on and so forth. You've got to have the contrast. Anyway, at this point, I had decided that there was an outpost monitoring the zone, and it absolutely has to be called the Eyrie, after the Weird Tales letter page / editorial. If this isn't your first story outline episode, then you may be familiar with something I'm realizing is a real pattern with me. Eventually I reach a point where I'm enjoying swimming in my ideas, but I then write in all caps on the page the words, "so okay," demanding some kind of narrative and summation. Here's what I had at this point. I wrote beneath my big "so okay," there is a tower or small keep called the Eyrie, built for another purpose several decades ago. It looks out over a swampy forest, in which a single decade ago, quote, a sorcerer simply burst. Educated somewhat by the scholarly noble she served in The Woman Who Floated Out of Time, our woman-at-arms, Toan, is now in late middle age and running the Eyrie, like a combination monastery and spying / kind of military outpost. They try to monitor the zone to see how its borders fluctuate, what comes out, not much, who returns from scouting within, not many, and never the same as when they went in. In this place are monks of the nature god that Voe is familiar with, Galana, and they try to fit everything that is found in this zone or that leaks out of it into their religion. There are also bards who Toan has on staff to try and create new stories to send out into the kingdom as warnings so that people might protect themselves, though they wonder if keeping the people in the dark might be better. It's lonely, dangerous work with no promise of riches, but it brings novelty to Toan's days, and she realized a long time ago that novelty matters to her most, hence all the cheating on her past partners, something we allude to the possibility of in the original story where she is featured. Almost forever looking out into the zone, she is deeply surprised when something weird walks up behind her, Voe. Her old friend is older, but not as much as she should be, wearing strange armor made of large bugs, and is clearly a very different person. So she has Voe restrained, and quizzes her on moments they shared in the original story where they met, The Woman Who Floated from Out of Time, and a period extending to where Voe ended up serving the Empire in the story that comes after that one, Monstrously Slow. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there are episodes about these guys, don't worry. Voe could say, "I had my freedom for many years, but I am once again serving some mad tyrant, and escaping their service is a much trickier puzzle than when I fled, the Empire monstrously slow, and went down to the not Syria from The Boy and the Blacksmith. So yeah, I'm enjoying a bit of continuity here, and I think in the second last story of the book, that's fine. People are pretty unlikely to leap ahead to the second last story as their starting point. And even so, I can write this in a way that's just like, oh, well, it's a shared history. Like, you don't have to have read it to get it. Toan is impressed Voe has gone that far, has traveled so widely. Voe says that Toan wouldn't believe the places she's been, the things that she's seen. Perhaps, Toan responds, I've seen my share just keeping watch here, lo these many years. Toan then gives Voe some examples of what she's seen, followed by gesturing at the futility of empirically measuring what she observes. And then her cynical, false, jolly routine perhaps drops as she gives our own medieval wording of the Annihilation quote that really stuck with me from my studies of that book. Some questions will ruin you if you're denied the answer long enough. This is to give us a hint of where Toan is at by this point, kind of updating us on her since we saw her as a youngin' in the previous story, the second story. Toan feels both empowered and, in the face of the zone, cursed by what the scholarly noble gave her. The scientific method. I may even look up some old science experiments that we could have laying about, which would plausibly be of the era that this is taking place in, which is sort of vaguely Carolingian era Europe. Seeing how the weird has worn down her old friend, Voe offers to help her understand the zone once and for all. She genuinely cares for Toan and figures if she can't free herself, she can at least provide freedom for her old friend who has already given Voe essentially the balm of Gilead by being familiar. In this way, she would also regain agency through nurturance, something which has come up a few times in recent stories. If you can't solve your own shit, you may as well get a feeling of control by helping someone else with theirs. Voe figures she's seen everything by now anyway, so fuck it. She'll get to the bottom of this, no problem. It's why the patron sent her here anyway. Now, this feels like a pretty good first third, let's say, or first quarter, depending on how fast we want to get into the zone for the story. And here, I kind of lost my way again, frustratingly, which is also weirdly suitable for something about a zone like this. Seeking direction, I decided to do something which had helped in a couple of previous story outlines. I decided to skip ahead, rather than doing them at the very end. I decided to skip ahead to my checklist of questions for stories in the final act of the novel. So, first off, what goes in Voe's carrier bag, and what does it signify? Honestly, I don't know yet. Something from Toan, maybe? Second question, how is Voe turning from feeling, in a state of stasis to continuing process? I figure in, quote, having seen it all, she's definitely in a kind of stasis at the start, so rediscovering childlike awe and wonder, perhaps in the swirling montage of childhood moments of imagination and reading, could be the thing. And maybe the wizard bursting was a side effect of their wrestling with the same ennui? Next question, how does the patron debt tug of war evolve? Well, of course, this is Voe finding her freedom, but what does that mean for us? We contemplated the patron debt tug of war as kind of a big capitalism debt slavery metaphor. I made a lot of notes exploring this. It was quite a tangle, and one of those things where getting too married to a metaphor can kind of give you trouble rather than helping you. But it did get me to sort of a next evolution of how she frees herself. I wrote, would it be too metatextual to have the point of view switch around like a radio being tuned for just the epilogue until it settles on Toan? The patron then interrogates her about what happened to Voe. We get a description of the final scene as she saw it, then a lament that she's free? Well, that's all well and good for her, but I can't just have some bright lights and magic and poof, I'm free. I've still got to watch the zone. Until the day I die, I've got to. And then maybe the patron offers her a similar freedom, quote unquote, to what I offered Voe back in the gibbet. Toan considers this, and then does a little better than Voe by turning down the patron. And the act of turning down the patron, of turning down the weird in a sense, is a turning point for Toan, who then perhaps mutters to herself, I just said no to a god or a demon or something. Surely I could request a new duty and sneak off if they say no to my request. Either way, surely one of the monks, or maybe, a head soldier character I was thinking of at this point, can run the Eyrie, and either way, maybe I can see if my first wife will still talk to me. I wrote down after this, it's not perfect, but what is? Big Boots Voe and her miracle? You can't plan your life around miracles, around becoming a legend. It really isn't perfect, but if I had the perfect answer to debt slavery capitalism or bridging the gap between the lofty ideals of most stories and the harsh realities of the reader's actual life, I'd have a Nobel Prize and be president of the world or something. Sometimes getting really close to the answer is still progress, and that's what I felt I had here, so okay, on to the next question in the checklist. How does Voe's attitude toward killing evolve? At this point, honestly, this question felt resolved. Killing for her became a chore at the end of the last story, and it can't go much further than that. But perhaps I could articulate this clearly in conversation with Toan, who remembers Voe as a young wannabe hero, perhaps after Voe in the present slays some horrible zone creature. In that sense, okay, her attitude doesn't evolve, but we kind of bring the reader's attention to the way it has evolved. How does the big cosmic horror of it all affect Voe? Well, essentially, it knocks her loose of her complacency, her seen-it-all cynicism. Horror it may be, but it is cosmic, what we're encountering here in the weird. Then, how does the story re-enchant the world? Well, I figure the initial connection with stories and imagination in childhood, reminding us of the joy of our first memory of reading, that's re-enchanting the world in a way, and cosmic horror's dark reminder that you can never see it all, never, does make the world, the universe, the cosmos, whatever, that much bigger. How does Voe regain agency through nurturance? So we covered this a little bit, but yeah, this has to be taking care of Toan. Maybe she's led to believe she has to sacrifice a friend to gain her freedom through some kind of wish or whatever, but she chooses to instead quote-unquote sacrifice herself, only to discover that that was the test, and so voila, she gets her wish for freedom, and to finally find the wizard who trapped her people on the island. Yes, and perhaps only one wish can be granted, which uses up the generative energy of the burst wizard, so the zone may be filled with myths and legends to spare, but it's no longer actively growing. And so Toan can feel okay leaving it. Oh, okay, this is evolving. And by granting Voe her wish, the wizard's deepest urge is satisfied, their wish not to be such a selfish bastard to grant someone else's greatest desire. Maybe? The montage, so to speak, in my head that I keep thinking of as leaping between various people's childhood memories of imagination of reading could be explained by the wizard having drawn their power from an incredibly potent source. The moment a child discovers the magic of reading. Again, corny if I say it out loud, but if we just imply it and we feel that we've earned it through the story, through the whole book, really could work. There's a lot of things we all think are very corny, and then we end up really enjoying them when they're well earned. I'm thinking off the top of my head of the ending of Guardians of the Galaxy, where dancing and the power of friendship carries the day. But, it works. A lot of people like that movie, including myself. Next question. Where is the culture shock? I would say this is to be found in Toan observing how changed Voe has been by her travels, how she does damn near every little thing should be noteworthy to Toan. Dressing, movement, eating, all kinds of little bits and pieces we can draw on in the actual writing. Heck, it could flow both ways, with Voe being shocked by what used to be her ways and seeing them played out through Toan and those around her. The next question in my checklist is, well, what is the thematic statement or conflict? I still hated what I had at this point. I kept wrestling with what do I want to say or ask that could be explored through these characters and tell us something about Voe. There's kind of a you can't go home again thing with the having returned to her home, but it's moved on since she's left, and then she chooses to embrace stepping into a whole new life rather than wish for her old one for a redo. But is that terribly profound? I don't know. I come back to something from The Weird Tale by S.T. Joshi here, which is that the quintessential phenomenon of the weird tale, the shattering of our conception of the universe and our place within it, our only reaction can be horror and madness. And then I think in my notes here, yeah, the weird can change how we see our place in the universe. It can reposition us, essentially. Okay. Meanwhile, this story is also kind of about how the weird can set you free, or at least it sets Voe free. Then again, it is a source of obligation to Toan, the weird there, if not exactly a prison. To the bards, it's a source of inspiration as they try to entertain and warn others. And to the soldiers, it's a confusing source of danger. So, yeah, okay, maybe we're getting there. Can I come up, though, with a clear statement or conflict about different people's relationship to the weird? Feeling another big step forward, I highlighted those words. Can we come up with a clear statement or conflict about different people's relationship to the weird? From this point, I made further notes on this question because it's so important and just hard to really nail down, although I keep getting closer each time I struggle toward that final answer of a thematic statement or conflict. Different relationships with the weird seems like a good place. Is it maybe really about the willingness to engage with unfamiliar art, to try to push the boundaries of art, even knowing you're unlikely to do anything truly new? But then I say to myself, well, let's remember the characters and setting may be fiction, but not to those characters. Let's keep this sincere. Let's not get metatextual and wanky about, art and creation instead of talking about what we really want to talk about. Also, weird is what most nerds and fans of Weird Tales, SFF stuff have been called at some point or another due to their interests. Maybe that's something? To the childhood moment of connection, that is weird and wonderful. Okay. And I remembered a sentence from Roadside Picnic about a person as strange as a noble, as deep as the zone. Okay. Is there a tension, perhaps, between the metaphorical, you must take a chance by opening yourself up to weird things if you want to learn new things about yourself, and the practical, physical, something weird could well be dangerous? Maybe we're going towards something like, is the wonder, awe, possibility worth the risk of danger, disappointment, etc.? Or it's kind of like, those who dare win, that's the motto of people with survivorship bias, really. Voe could well have survivorship bias. Toan, meanwhile, has seen too many people die due to the zone to take risks so easily. God, do I simply return to weird will set you free? And then found myself wondering, how do you root a tale of the undefinable in something universally understood? I really don't want to reduce this to some flowery take on how do you weigh risks versus reward. And honestly, when something is weird enough, is abstract enough, well, it kind of loses all meaning to the person perceiving it. And unless it's a danger, it's hard to care about, really. So really what I'm gunning for here is kind of the uncanny, the unheimlich. That is the thing, an event or thing that is unsettling in a way that feels oddly familiar rather than simply mysterious. At which point I had a lightning bolt strike my head, and I wrote all capitals and then highlighted immediately after. I wrote, the border of the zone. The wizard's body is the border. Kind of like an ethereal ring of Saturn or something, particulate matter, visible or otherwise, mystical or otherwise. When the body burst, it set the border of the zone. And within it, the energy makes strange things happen. I love the visual of that. I love how it's a neat answer to the mystery of Voe and Toan being like, okay, well, what is the heart of this goddamn thing? Well, it's not actually at the heart. It's the border, right? And then in our second act, well, we've set it up so that if Voe looks like she has to choose whether or not to sacrifice Toan to get what she wants, hopefully the reader won't know what Voe's going to do, because if they've been reading the book in order, which they probably have read most of it by the time they get to the second last story, they'll have seen Voe choose a friend once over the quote-unquote treasure in one story and choose the treasure over the friend in another. Again, I'm relying on other stories having been read, but it doesn't feel so wild at this penultimate point. Once again, I write so, and then I do bullet points here, just working my way through it in my head. We open on Toan and Voe's reunion, wallow in the familiar. Voe's mission aligns with Toan's desire to understand the zone, and Voe's muscle/weird experience convince Toan that they would have a chance, actually, this time. Presumably the exploded wizard would be in the center, so they figure they grab a bard and a soldier, someone to record this thing, and a soldier, of course, is to help defend them. And then they cross the border of the zone. That's going to be a big moment, especially because we know we're going to come back to it later. And we have some inter-team chat that allows us to get to know the bard before we have our first kind of weird encounter that probably kills them, or essentially kills them, removes them from the board. We can then have more interpersonal conflict as the soldier tries to end the mission, but Voe and Towan go further and he has to follow. Then they have a weird encounter which nearly kills the soldier. It's got to be danger, right? They get to the part then that nobody has ever gotten past. Voe herself wrestles with this point, and after drawing on past experiences, decides this isn't it. The way to get past it, she will say, is to turn back. The soldier will then balk, then die when he tries to show up Voe by defeating the big weird center. Neither Voe nor Towan warn him very much because he sucks. They travel back. Voe talks in the language of defeat, and in her telling of the story to her patron, in what I realize at this point for what I'm going to do next to work has to be present tense, so there will be probably a tense change for this story. But yes, as she is in the present tense, narrating what's going on to her patron, she is trying to hide her excitement. Then Voe stops on the border and moves along it. This part feels the thickest, Voe could say. Really, the border is the only place I actually felt anything. Here, we pull a big move. We do switch perspective just the one time to Towan's past tense POV, saying, well, you're an omniscient being, aren't you? She addresses the patron. You tell me where Voe is. No, please don't make me live it again. 10 times you've made me go through this. I don't know what any of it means. At which point maybe we have on the page, because now I'm a publisher, I think a layout a bit more, right? On the page we could have 2 columns of text. One on the left is the fast fading text of Voe's point of view as she escapes the patron by way of the wizard sort of wish granting and drawing on the last of his power that came from multiversal connection with people's childhood reading imagination things. The other column fading in is Towan's point of view, and this is where we perhaps tease the idea of Voe essentially sacrificing her friend by maybe offering her up as a replacement or having the patron take her as a replacement, whatever. We'll have to be really careful about order of information at this point to try and string the reader along as far as we can, even if only for another paragraph or so, until we realize that Voe has not actually sacrificed her friend at all. And then we have all that stuff I've already relayed about Towan kind of turning down the patron after the patron tries to shake answers out of her and then offer her the same kind of servitude that Voe had. And Towan wanders off to the races for the rest of her life, wondering whatever happened to Voe after she vanished, the answer to which being the final story of the book that comes after that. At this point, I paused and was like, all right, so the borders, the liminal spaces are the true realm of possibility. I'm into that. The wizard's body like a ring around Saturn, etc. The weird can change how we see our place in the universe, and we want it to change Voe's place, physical place, in the universe. I then babbled on a little bit more and eventually was like, okay, stop. All right, we have a sequence of events. We have a core cast, Bard, Soldier, Towan, and Voe. We have an ending. What do we still need? Unlike so many of my previous outlines, the final thing I did here was not the writing out of the whole story in, story beats, whatever. It was not working through a story checklist. It was me having done all those things and being still a little lost. So the last thing I did was try to answer the question of what do we still need, and then give myself those things. Still, I needed a coherent, thematic conflict or statement, and a clear articulation of how Voe becomes free. I have all these notions swinging around that I've told you, but still don't really have a clear articulation, and some more detail on the weird events. Right now, I literally have just insert weird stuff that's dangerous, and I don't know, it kills this guy and hurts that guy and whatever, which is not specific. So, one last wrestling match with the thematic conflict. I just threw some stuff down the page, just trying to brute force my way through. Eventually, it got me to wondering, well, how do we know when to reinforce boundaries and when to challenge them? Boundaries seeming such a big part of this story between the literal boundary of the zone and the boundary around Toan's life and the boundary that Voe is trying to escape of her servitude. How do we tell between the two? How do we tell what is weird? Our relationship to boundaries is certainly the thing here in a very literal way. When Voe communes with the wizard, for example, the bard telling the stories maybe thinks they're pushing boundaries. The soldier, of course, pushes the boundaries of good taste by being a jerk, I imagined, but is otherwise a fan of boundaries. He's a soldier. He reinforces the things as a guard, essentially. Toan oversees a boundary. That's her life. Voe feels like there are no boundaries she hasn't crossed, except, of course, her prison-like servitude. All right, so in the interest of finishing this, I say I'm okay playing a little loose and saying the thematic conflict is, how do you know where boundaries are and when to respect or challenge them? Generally, we're thematically playing with this, and it feels appropriate for a zone story in particular. Civilization and barbarism even come to mind, the classic SNS theme. All right, good enough. Done. Or so I thought, yet 5 minutes later, I actually got the thematic statement that I needed when trying to answer the question of how does Voe become free? I figured, she discovers the true boundary, the dispersed wizard, and respects him while challenging the boundary of her patron servitude. Something, the magic of reading. And then I wrote, to set yourself free from something, especially a way of life, you have to be able to imagine something else. That's it. To set yourself free from something, especially a way of life, you have to be able to imagine something else. For all that Voe feels she's seen everything, at this point in her life she's so beaten down she can no longer imagine life outside patron servitude, even if she has her carrier bag full of mementos and a vision of what she would do with them someday later. Her arc in this story is getting to a place where she can imagine the freedom to found a community, which is what we want her to do after the book is over, essentially. We kind of want Voe to face a dilemma, something like having to sacrifice her friend Toan to gain her wish of freedom. Voe ponders if maybe the friendship could be sacrificed instead of the friend, then realizes this is all just a seductive narrative. She appeals to the wizard to free her and feel powerful not by forcing her to do something horrible, but instead to feel powerful and good by defying a horrible, powerful entity, her patron, which also comes back to regaining agency through nurturance, in this case the wizard sort of nurturing Voe. And we can even riff on how many science fiction and fantasy fans keep longing for futures or fantasy realms that are just what we have now, perhaps intensified or decayed with a different skin, and that's easy. Coming up with something truly new is hard. But okay, what propels Voe along this arc? Her re-engagement with Toan and exploring the zone, I guess, which brings us more detail of the weird events, the last thing we really do need here. This was probably the most loose of my answers to the last three things I needed. I made notes on things like how the flow of time can evoke weirdness, including adjacent things like gravity and air pressure changing. What can we do with all five senses? That kind of thing. What's the ecosystem like? Are there odd animals, transformed humans, plant people, mushrooms, insects? What's going on with those? Quote unquote normal relations messed up like a flower reproducing by sprouting from the body of a bee. There's thematic things, maybe we have common fears and fantasies of children in the age range of when children most commonly discover the way reading opens up the vistas of imagination. 6, 7, I was 4, other people were probably 3, whatever. I literally start listing common fears of children aged 2 to 4. I just Google it, the dark, thunder, shadows, being separated from your parents, changes in routine, or fears related to potty training. Wouldn't that be amazing? Voe has to wrestle with potty training in this story. The struggle between connection and wanting to do things their own way, and so on, as I tried to get down some kind of absolute core element upon which the weird would be built, rather than just reaching for, what if a dog had tentacles for legs? In Annihilation, there's a very adult fear, a line that reads, "Our instruments are useless, our methodology broken, our motivations selfish." And at this point, I just stopped. I realized I had all the big things I really needed, and knowing the precise specifics of the weird sections of the book, I had given myself some fun raw material here that I could play with later when I actually write the draft, and future Oliver will probably discover something far more satisfying in the actual writing on the page than in playing around in the outline stage forever, just being like, what is weird? How can weird? Why weird? I had to remind myself that the weird, you can only ever kind of half know it, because as I see it anyway, from all my research and thinking and experience as someone who's read and enjoyed watching and listening and so on to so many other narratives of the weird, you can only really ever half know it, because the flipping point is that if you knew it fully, it wouldn't be weird. It can at most be half known. It can most be uncanny. Another word that floats around weird tales quite a bit. And so I finished outlining the last story for the Voe novel that I'm going to outline for quite some time, because I'm going to write the actual prose drafts, the manuscripts of all the other stories before I try to outline or just dive into the writing of the final story, which for now remains called Stairs. Though I have written a couple of short stories on the side, I do feel that the vast majority of my writing for years now has been outlining. So much outlining. And I enjoy it, clearly. And I enjoy relating it to others in this podcast, clearly. But eventually, you gotta move on. And I'm very keen to do that. So I made the decision. The decision is made. I have started working on the manuscript in more earnest. I'd written a few hundred words earlier for The Woman Who Floated Through Time, so it's kind of fitting that that story was so on my mind while outlining the Eyrie. I have some big thoughts about how the podcast will be moving forward, and the Patreon, that I think I'll share in a little mini episode that I'll put up later. So how are we going to close this one, folks? Well, I think I'm going to close it by reviewing the big picture of the whole novel in the most economical, quick way I can, in the way that I did in my notebook. This is actually the most up-to-date section of all my notes across 3 big fat notebooks, plus that skinny guy, I guess, I mentioned earlier, for this whole project. Everything after what I'm about to relay to you is blank pages. What that is I did something I had done before when I was at an earlier stage in the novel, but now I realized I could do it completely, and with some updates on a couple of stories, a list of the thematic conflicts and statements for every single story from the first one to this one that I had just walked you through the outline of. I don't expect you to memorize these. God, that'd be ridiculous. But just let them kind of wash over you and see if, in them washing over you, they do what they did for me, which was help give me a sense of what the whole damn book is about. Story number 1, Voe. You have to change if you want to grow. Number 2, The Woman Who Floated Through Time. It's better to seek knowledge for the collective good than to hoard it for personal gain. Number 3, Monstrously Slow. We can lose it through our actions, but we don't have to earn our humanity with deeds or raw ability. Number 4, The Boy and the Blacksmith. Telling a story about what you want won't make it true. Number 5, Disgrace the Stone. Authority figures often use the concept of heroism to justify or manipulate others into sacrificing themselves for their benefit. Number 6, Kinship in Koltum. Loyal, open, and honest friendship is the most important thing. Number 7, Sacred Thievery. Faith in other people is more important than faith in God or gods in the unknown. Story number 8, Flighting Fancy. We create and care about meaning. Nothing else does. Certainly not the cosmos, and that's fine. That's not what it does. Story number 9, Carry Me from Koltum. As you go through life, you can't take everything with you. Story number 10, My People. How do you choose between practical need and impractical dream? Story number 11, Voe Loses It. Sometimes how we choose to protect ourselves hurts us most of all. Story number 12, The Gibbet. Perfection, real or imagined, is a prison from which only change will set you free. Story 13, Inner Sea. How do you create a warning which will outlast your language? Story number 14, Love Letter to a Sailor. Where is the threshold between knowing enough to protect yourself and being aware of so much you go mad? Story number 15, Imported God. Transformation is deeply relational. Story number 16, The Eyrie. To set yourself free from one life, you need to be able to imagine a better one. Okay, thank you so much for listening to this and any other episodes, even if they're all the episodes or just one other episode, whatever. Thank you so much for listening. The podcast is not ending, but it is going to change and mutate a bit. I know I'd like to do an episode dedicated to my experiences in publishing so far. Almost certainly we'll do an episode dedicated specifically to crowdfunding, which is a huge subject unto itself, and do more interviews as well as share things that kind of come out of the publishing, like the short story discussion panels. In the meanwhile, if you have anything you would really like to hear me discuss related to my publishing so far, or to crowdfunding, then please drop me a line at soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as ever, our wonderful intro-outro music is by Gloria Guns, and I am your host, Oliver Brackenbury, and you can support us by going to soimwritinganovel.com/support the show, which has links to our Patreon, Coffee, and PayPal. Man, this is a really big moment I've been working toward in handwritten outline pages for 5 years, and on this podcast for like 3.5. I refuse to check and come back and re-record that. So yeah, thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll keep coming with me along on this journey. See you soon.